You don't get to lecture me on Jewish values or history or heritage or culture. I wear the yarmulke on my head because I live my religion. I pray 3 times a day in Hebrew because I live my religion. I eat kosher because I live my religion. I study Talmud daily because I live my religion. I don't need to hear from a bunch of people who finally got in touch with their Jewish roots when a bunch of Jews were murdered by an anti-Semite. I've been doing this my entire life, and it's not going to change now. Okay, before I go any further, obviously, I do want to say nothing but obviously tremendous sympathy and comfort should be had for everybody who suffered because of the Tree of Life massacre. Hamakom Yinachem Eschem B'So Shar Havlei Yerushalayim. That's a Hebrew phrase meaning the place should comfort you in the gates of Jerusalem. And now, because I think it's important, since we are in Pittsburgh, I want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism and the actual threat of anti-Semitism, because I think that there's been a cynical attempt by a lot of folks in the media who don't care about a lot of different types of anti-Semitism to hone in on one type of anti-Semitism at the expense of all the other types of anti-Semitism. Now, let me be clear. As I've said, white supremacist anti-Semitism is vile and disgusting, and I'm going to talk a lot about it tonight. But if the only sort of anti-Semitism you are concerned about is the anti-Semitism that backs your own political narrative, you're not actually concerned about anti-Semitism. So let's talk about this. Anti-Semitism has existed as long as the Jewish people, and it's utterly chameleonic. It's not quite like other forms of hate. Other forms of hate largely boil down to we think that this group of people is inferior to us in some way. Anti-Semitism, however, is basically a giant conspiracy theory. It suggests that Jews are in charge of everything, that we run the media, that we run the banks, that we run the global financial system. We are the communists who are in charge of the Soviet Union, but we are also the capitalists who are in charge of Goldman Sachs. Behind every rock and every tree, there is a Jew. Behind every success and every failure, there's a Jew. It's basically a giant conspiracy theory. And these days, anti-Semitism globally breaks down into 3 separate categories. There's sort of right-wing anti-Semitism, and then there's left-wing anti-Semitism, and then there's radical Islamic anti-Semitism. And if you ignore any of these forms of anti-Semitism because it's inconvenient to you, again, you don't care about anti-Semitism. So let's start with the type of anti-Semitism that was reflected in the Tree of Life shooting. This was right-wing nationalistic anti-Semitism. Now, when I say right-wing, I don't mean American conservative. That is not the same thing. It is much more akin to the radical right-wing that you see in some places in Europe. White supremacists are not conservative because conservatism is all about the idea that we are individuals given rights by God as creatures made in God's image, and that has nothing to do with beliefs in the inferiority of any particular group, or beliefs about immigration, or beliefs about Jews, or any of the rest of that. Conservatism is a belief, again, that we are all given these rights and that government was instituted to protect these rights. That's the entirety of the philosophy. Everything else flows from that. Right-wing anti-Semitism, the reason that it's used that way, the reason people use that sort of language is because they are contrasting it with left-wing European politics. So the right wing in Europe is much more nationalistic than the internationalist left that exists in Europe, and so the white supremacist movement in the United States, which is tied in with nationalism, is considered right-wing by any sort of European standard. In this view, the presence of an independent Jewish community is a threat to national identity. And the presence of a Jewish community in any community that also speaks about politics is a serious threat, right? This is the argument of Haman in the book of Esther, that there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among other peoples in all the provinces of your realm whose laws are different, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. And this is that sort of anti-Semitism. So the argument is that the independent Jewish community is hypocritical for wanting to remain separate in some ways while urging broader human rights. And this, of course, is what was reflected in the Tree of Life shooting, where a white supremacist, nationalist, European-style right-wing guy, monster, made a suggestion that left-wing immigration positions were reflective of Judaism, and the Jews are hypocrites, and the Jews are the ones who are trying to tear down Western civilization. Okay, so that is type of anti-Semitism number 1. And to be completely intellectually honest, which I think we ought to do when we are talking about bigotry, the fact is that in 2016, there were alt-right groups that were on the rise in the United States and were gaining additional credence in the United States, and President Trump did a bad job of quashing that rise. I was there, I remember it. I received all the tweets, I received all the death threats. And the fact is, the President of the United States was winking and nodding at some folks on the alt-right. Now, I don't think he was doing that because the President is anti-Semitic. I don't think the President is anti-Semitic. In fact, I know pretty well that the President is not anti-Semitic. The President has an unfortunate tendency to wink and nod at anybody who praises him. It doesn't matter who it is. Could be Vladimir Putin, could be Kim Jong-un. It legitimately does not matter. Anybody who is nice to the President of the United States is loath to criticize. And anybody who criticizes the President of the United States, he jumps on with both feet in spiked shoes. And it's just the way that President Trump operates. But that was bad behavior in 2016. It was bad behavior in Charlottesville in 2017. And we can't ignore that because he is the President of the United States and was a presidential candidate at the time. A second type of anti-Semitism, the one that the press will not talk about because it is not convenient for their political positioning. This is left-wing anti-Semitism. Left-wing anti-Semitism is much more mainstream than right-wing anti-Semitism. Left-wing anti-Semitism has seeped into the heart of the Democratic Party. Left-wing anti-Semitism has seeped into the heart of democratic philosophy. Left-wing anti-Semitism is based on the idea that there are hierarchies of power, right? Just like the right-wing anti-Semitism was based on this conspiracy theory that Jews are in charge of the levers of immigration, they're going to ruin society. Left-wing anti-Semitism is based on the idea that there are these powerful people, the Jews, and these powerful people are victimizing other people who are less powerful. And because Jews are pretty successful around the world when they are allowed to be, they must have thus participated in exploitation and egregious human rights violation. This is all part of a broader intersectional theory that you see more broadly on college campuses these days that says that we can value a person's point of view by their belonging in a particular group, right? Because there are these hierarchies of power, and all inequalities in American society are reflective of these hierarchies of power. So if, for example, in the broader context, the black community in the United States is disproportionately poor, that is a result of white hierarchies of power making the black community in the United States disproportionately poor. And the solution for that is to set up an intersectional hierarchy where we don't listen to white people talk about economics. We only listen to people who have been part of a victimized group talk about economics, and even then only if they speak in the language of intersectionality. Well, this theory taken to the Jewish context suggests that these very powerful Jews, very wealthy, they're very good at what they do. A lot of doctors, a lot of lawyers are Jewish, a lot of Nobel Prize winners. Their country is pretty powerful over in the Middle East. This must be because the Jews are great victimizers and human rights violators. They're part of the power structure. This is the anti-Semitism of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, who says, "Behold, the people of children are more numerous and stronger than we are." Now, this anti-Semitism crosses streams with anti-Israel sentiment because, of course, Israel does punch far above its weight. So when left-wing anti-Semites look at Israel, they say because Israel is strong, it's the Goliath of the region, supposedly. Because of all of this, this means that Israel is the victimizer and all of its opponents are the victimized. Okay, this is the form of left-wing anti-Semitism. Then finally, we get to radical Islamic anti-Semitism. Radical Islamic anti-Semitism, again, something that the left does not want to talk about because it shatters multicultural perceptions that all people are equal in their belief systems, which is not true. All people are equal in their inherent rights. They are not all equal in their belief systems. A lot of people believe some really bad stuff. Radical Islamic anti-Semitism is actually the most traditional form of anti-Semitism. It's basically, the argument there is basically the Jews believe a false religion. Promulgating this false religion is somehow undermining my religion, and therefore the Jews have to be stopped. And of course, it's more reflective of things like Christian anti-Semitism 1,000 years ago, or forms of other anti-Semitism around the world that are religiously based. And it does drift over into Nazi-esque anti-Semitism, in which members of the radical Islamic world will sort of combine their religious anti-Semitism, Judaism is a gutter religion, in the words of Louis Farrakhan, with the idea that Jews are the sons of pigs and monkeys, as you see in some of the textbooks in the Palestinian Authority. Now, the question becomes, which of these three types of threats, which of these three types of anti-Semitism is the most threatening to Jews in the United States and to Western civilization as a whole? Because anti-Semitism is basically what happens when civilizations begin to fray. If you imagine that a civilization is a quilt, when the threads begin to come apart, anti-Semitism tends to seep through exactly where those threads are fraying. And it's becoming a rising threat in Europe, certainly. It's becoming a rising threat in the United States. There have been studies showing that hate crimes are up this year among Jews. Jews always lead among hate crimes. We are leaders in everything. Nobel Prizes, hate crimes. In terms of individual violent attacks in the United States, there's no question that white supremacists have posed an outsized threat. And this has been true long before President Trump was president. In 1999, the West Valley JCC, a few miles from where I live, was shot up by a white supremacist. That same year, a white supremacist in Chicago shot a bunch of Jews just walking down the street. We've seen the Seattle JCC attacked by a white supremacist. We've seen the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. attacked by a white supremacist. Like, this is not supremely rare, unfortunately. It does happen, and there's a reason that virtually every synagogue where I live in Los Angeles, which is a big Jewish population, has heavy security, right? We've had an armed guard long before Tree of Life happened, specifically because of this sort of threat. But to Jews worldwide, and to Jews more deeply over time, the clear answer to which of these types of anti-Semitism is most threatening is not the white supremacist threat. Okay, the real answer is institutionalized left-wing anti-Semitism, which works in combination with radical Islamic anti-Semitism at a high level. Okay, so this requires us to ask another question, what's the best way to fight anti-Semitism? And to understand the answer to that question, we have to understand that there are really two views of anti-Semitism itself. What is anti-Semitism? So, as I say, one perspective is it's a giant conspiracy theory in which Jews are responsible for everything, and that all types of anti-Semitism, right-wing, left-wing, and radical Islamic, are all encompassed by the rubric of anti-Semitism. Basically, at root, they're all the same thing. The Jews are responsible for every bad thing that's happening to me. And President Trump actually got this right when he spoke about this. When he spoke in the aftermath of the Pittsburgh shooting, he said, "We must stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters to defeat anti-Semitism and vanquish the forces of hate." That's what it is. Throughout the centuries, the Jews have endured terrible persecution. Those seeking their destruction, we will seek their destruction, right? This is the most honest form of calling out anti-Semitism I've ever seen a president make. And it was President Trump. President Obama's view was not as accurate. He tweeted out after the Tree of Life shooting, "We grieve for the Americans murdered in Pittsburgh. All of us have to fight the rise of anti-Semitism and hateful rhetoric against those who look, love, or pray differently. And we have to stop making it so easy for those who want to harm the innocent to get their hands on a gun." Well, in this view, anti-Semitism is basically just a subset of bigotry. It's just a bigotry, like any other bigotry. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just people don't like Jews in the same way that some people don't like blacks, or some people don't like Hispanics, or some people are misogynists. Jews are just one member of the intersectional coalition. Furthermore, that means that you have to treat an anti-Semitic attack on a Jew by a Muslim in Israel in a different way than you would treat an anti-Semitic attack on a Jew in Pittsburgh by a white supremacist. Why? Because the victimizer in each of these cases stands in a different place in the intersectional hierarchy. And this is where the left-wing view of what anti-Semitism is gets really dangerous. And it is mainstream, right? This is the mainstream view, is that anti-Semitism is like any other bigotry, except it's less important than other bigotries because Jews tend to be more powerful. And the only time we're supposed to care about anti-Semitism is when somebody who is more powerful on the intersectional hierarchy than the Jews victimizes Jews. When white supremacists victimize Jews, that's really important. But when a radical Muslim victimizes a Jew, as has happened in Los Angeles too, a member of our community was murdered at the LAX ticket counter for El Al by a radical Muslim in 2002. When that happens, no national attention. When there is a shooting at a synagogue by a white supremacist, national attention. And I'm not just saying this as sort of a general point. The reality is that the New York Times admitted as much recently. The New York Times had a piece about hate crimes in New York, and what they found in this piece, they said there were 22 hate crimes that had been documented in New York. None of them could be attributed to white supremacists. And then they admitted, we haven't reported on any of these hate crimes because they didn't fit our narrative. This is a direct quote from the New York Times, quote, "In fact, it is the very backgrounds of people who commit hate crimes in the city that make combating and talking about anti-Semitism in New York much harder. Bias stemming from long-standing ethnic tensions in the city presents complexities that many liberals have chosen simply to ignore. When a Hasidic man or woman is attacked by anyone in New York, mainstream progressive advocacy groups do not typically send out emails calling for concern and fellowship and candlelight vigils in Union Square. Why not? Because it turns out that only certain types of anti-Semitism are important in the left-wing view. And that is inherently dangerous. And that also explains why the Democratic Party is fine with the creeping anti-Semitism that has emerged inside its own party. And there is no question it is much more mainstream than anti-Semitism inside the Republican Party. There is no doubt about this. I was at the DNC in 2012 when Democrats booed God and Jerusalem in the platform. Keith Ellison, an outspoken anti-Semite and acolyte of Louis Farrakhan, who calls Judaism a gutter religion and says that Jews are the children of Satan. Keith Ellison nearly became head of the DNC last year and was just elected Attorney General of Minnesota. Bill Clinton stood next to Louis Farrakhan at Aretha Franklin's funeral. Imagine a Republican standing next to David Duke at somebody's funeral. Would the controversy never end? Of course it would never end. But Bill Clinton can stand right next to Louis Farrakhan, no big deal. Linda Sarsour, who's a terrorist supporter, heads the Women's March, and Democrats continue to associate with the Women's March, no problem there. Democrats in the last election cycle elected 2 anti-Semites, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. And we pretended it was all just, it's great, it's diversity, it's Muslim members of Congress. Well, there can be Muslim members of Congress who aren't anti-Semitic. These 2 don't fit the bill. Tlaib denies that Jews ought to have a state. She stands in favor of the anti-Semitic boycott, sanctions, divestment movement. She's expressed admiration for the anti-Semitic terrorist Razmia Odeya, and she is in Congress now. Omar is even worse, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. In 2014, she tweeted, quote, "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel." Have you heard a peep about this from a single Democrat? Like any Democrat? Of course not. They'll talk about Steve King until the cows come home, which is fine, but they have nothing to say about Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib. In Britain, the next Prime Minister of Britain could be Jeremy Corbyn, who's openly anti-Semitic and sympathizes with Hamas and Hezbollah. Okay, all of this is truly more threatening because, again, if you believe in this intersectional politics, this also means that you are more sympathetic to people who are anti-Semitic as long as they are coming from downtrodden areas of the world. The rise in anti-Semitism in Europe is largely not due to radical nationalists in Europe. It is largely due to radical Islamists who have been imported into the heart of Europe and are attacking Jews at record rates, which is why Jews are now leaving Europe at record rates. Okay, so here's the bottom line. If you actually want to fight anti-Semitism, and I'm speaking to people right, left, and center now, you need to actually fight anti-Semitism when you see it. You don't get to call out one form of anti-Semitism while ignoring other forms. You don't get to claim that it exists only on one side of the aisle when it exists much more on your own side of the aisle. And you certainly don't get to claim that those of us who have spent our entire lives fighting anti-Semitism are members of a white supremacist movement. Anti-Semitism goes to the root of what it means to be American. It is blatantly un-American. America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. We get the eternal values upon which the country was founded from the same Bible that Moses brought down from Sinai, addended by Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. George Washington wrote to the Jewish community of Newport in 1790, "The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." An attack on the Tree of Life was not just an attack on Jews. It was an attack on all Americans. It was an attack on all Jews, too, not just Jews in Pittsburgh, but the Jews who are currently living in their basements for fears of rockets falling on them from the Gaza Strip, the Jews who are afraid to walk the streets in France wearing a yarmulke for fear that they will be beat up or killed, the Jews who are leaving Malmö, Sweden, because they can't walk safely at night in the streets. It was an attack on all those Jews, but it was an attack on Americans more broadly, too. Anyone who wishes to imbue our children with a sense of godliness in a dark world and a sense of eternal value in a society that is currently eating away at itself. The only proper response to anti-Semitism is to fight back against it wherever we see it, and to stubbornly cling to that which stamps us with the image of God, to fight darkness with light and untruth with truth and death with life. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.